10 months ago, Canada picked Mark Carney over Pierre Poilievre. Some people celebrated, some people panicked, some people just hoped their lives would just get easier. Fast forward to now, grocery bills are still the worst in the G7. Alberta is openly talking about leaving the country. Pierre lost his own seat, then had to move to Alberta just to get back into Parliament. On paper, we got change. In real life, it feels like the same operating system with a different face. In episode 1, I pulled 3 spreads for Canada, for Carney, and for Pierre. Now, 10 months later, I want to show you where these cards have already showed up in the real world and how they reveal who actually holds the power in this country right now.
Truth doesn't trend, but it pulses beneath the noise. This is where signals cut through static. The truth isn't always trending, but it's worth finding. Stay disrupted.
Hello, welcome back to Dusrupted. If you're new here, my name is George Dus. I'm an intuitive advisor, tech-savvy mystic, and recovering IT guy who has spent 30 years watching complex systems do exactly what they were designed to do, not what people thought they would do. On this show, we blend geopolitics, Canadian and global politics, consciousness, and tech with intuitive readings of the energy underneath all of it. No doom scrolling, no hopening, just pattern recognition, meaning, and practical grounding. Now, if you've never come across Oracle or Tarot cards before, here's all you need to know. These are decks of cards, each one carrying a title and an image. The title is the signal. It names an energy, a pattern, or a force. Think of it less like fortune telling and more like a mirror held up to what's already in motion. You ask a question, you draw cards, and you read what the archetype is sitting in that position of the spread. That's it. No crystal ball, no smoke. Just pattern recognition in a different language. In episode 1, I laid out 3 Oracle card spreads. One for the nation, one for Mark Carney, and one for Pierre Poilievre. If you haven't heard it, not to worry, I'll catch you up. If you have, honestly, it's been 10 months. You've probably forgotten half of it anyways. That's okay, we're starting fresh. Today we are going to look at how these cards show up in the real world 10 months later, why the underlying dynamics have barely moved even though the headlines have changed completely, and what that tells us about who actually holds power in this country right now. Let's rewind briefly and then zoom all the way out. I'm not going to reread every card from episode 1, but I want the core picture clear again. The Canada spread painted this landscape in the position of current political climate, banking, and currency. Translation, whatever slogan you put on your lawn sign, the real issue was the money system, debt, inflation, central banks, who actually benefits when the government says it's rescuing you. Surprise attacks showed up in the public sentiment position. People felt blindsided by platforms dropped at the last minute, by new spending commitments, by policy reversals nobody saw coming. For hidden influences, the card was offering donation. That is not grandma chipping in $20. That is foreign money, corporate money, NGO money, quietly buying outcomes behind the curtain. In the challenges ahead position, tension escalates. A pressure cooker, not a policy seminar. Pandemic health crisis landed in the opportunity for change position. Not necessarily another virus, a deeper crisis of trust in institutions. People generally sick of the whole apparatus. Tornado winds came up as the likely outcome. Fast, chaotic shifts that are hard to make sense of in real time. That's really hard to keep up with. And for long-term impact, society collapse. And I said this clearly in episode 1, that does not mean a Mad Max scenario, unless you're in Minnesota. It can mean the stories, the legitimacy, and the trust collapsing, even when the buildings are still physically standing. That was the national spread, On that stage, I pulled spreads for the two major players. For Mark Carney, the 5 cards were corrupt dealings, tornado winds, disaster wreckage, military action, and uprising rebellion. And for Pierre Poilievre, innocent truthful, enemy force, explosive situation, planned collapse, and food shortage. And here's what honestly surprised even me. Not just how randomly shuffled cards captured what was already happening 10 months ago, but how true they still hold today, looking back at all of it. 10 months later, these archetypes have barely moved. The costumes got a little wrinkled, the script has not. Different tie, same game. We have talked about the energy and the cards. Now I want to walk through the actual power map, layer by layer. We start with what you can see, the elections, the podiums, the affordability promises. Then we go underneath that to the financial layer that most people feel but can't quite name. Then to the provinces, the Arctic, and Pierre's situation. And finally, what all this actually feels like to live inside. So let's start at the surface. On the surface, politics looks simple. There's a winner, there's a loser. Someone gets to stand at the podium and say, Canadians have given us a clear mandate. On April 28, 2025, Mark Carney took that podium. The Liberals won enough seats to form a government again. Technically, a minority situation. He also needs the cooperation from other parties to pass major legislation. But the story we were sold was, we chose a direction, now we will implement it. So let's talk about what got implemented. Carney came in promising that he would be judged on affordability, specifically on grocery prices. He said that directly. He also promised to build the strongest economy in the G7, to eliminate internal trade barriers, to supercharge housing, to stabilize Canada's relationship with the United States. Here's the results 10 months in. Stats Canada numbers show food prices are up 6.2% year over year through the end of 2025. And again, year after year is the key word here. The fastest pace among G7 countries. By January 2026, overall food inflation, including restaurants, hit 7.3%. Second month in a row, Canada is number 1 in the G7 on food inflation. Beef is up close to 19% year over year. Coffee up 30%. For comparison, the United States, which has been running an aggressive tariff policy that everyone said would crush their consumers, posted food inflation at about 2.9%, less than half of ours. He said, "Judge me on affordability." Okay, we are judging. His answer was the Canada Groceries and Essentials benefit, a top-up to an old GST credit, rebranded with a shinier name, announced from inside a grocery store with the price tag removed, I might add. This is not even a brand new idea. Trudeau boosted the GST credit in 2025 as an affordability measure, ran a grocery rebate version in 2023, ran a GST holiday through the winter of 2024 into 2025. Carney took that same GST credit, renamed it to the Canada Groceries and Essentials benefit, announced inside a grocery store, and presented it as a new government's responding to a crisis. People on X were posting Trudeau and Carney side by side, almost word for word, talking about helping Canadians with the cost of essentials.
Created the new grocery rebate, which will allow an eligible couple with 2 children to receive up to $467. This is a measure that will help make life more affordable for around 11 million individuals and families.
So today we're announcing that our government is launching the new Canada's Groceries and Essentials benefit. This will deliver hundreds of dollars more into the bank accounts of more than 12 million Canadians.
Same policy, different suit, different branding. Even Pierre said in the House, right to Carney's face. He called it the Trudeau-era rebate that barely covers a few trips to the grocery store. The Conservative House Leader called it a recycled Trudeau-era policy. And I want to be fair here. That's real money for someone who's really struggling, and I'm not dismissing it. But let's put it next to the actual problem. Canada's Food Price Report 2026 says the average family of four is expected to spend about $17,572 on food in 2026, nearly $1,000 more than in 2025, and roughly 27% more than 5 years ago. For low-income families who qualify, the new benefit offers a one-time payment of up to $1,890. That maximum can offset the projected increase for 1 year, but that doesn't even come close to repairing the multi-year damage already baked into people's grocery bills. And here's the part almost nobody has heard about. In a study that the Bank of Canada released this month, their own economists say that one of the biggest drivers of food inflation in 2025, it wasn't drought or greedification. It was Ottawa's own counter tariffs on U.S. food imports, including products that should have been CUSMA exempt. Can you believe that? Those tariffs were sold as an elbows up move against America, but they mostly punished Canadian shoppers instead. Dalhousie food expert and economist Sylvain Charlebois did a full interview on this on a YouTube channel called The Leaders on the Frontier. It's called The Hidden Crisis Behind Canada's Skyrocketing Food Prices. I'll link it in the description, and it's worth the full watch. But here's a clip where he gets into exactly what Ottawa's own data revealed.
The thing is, David, is that I think a lot of people are still in denial. They don't really see the big picture or the big problem right now. They're often listening to the overwhelming narrative pushed by mainstream media, and frankly, I mean, I've been pretty active on social media to explain to people that we don't get the big picture, we don't get the whole picture just by listening to newscasts and things like that. For example, I mean, the Bank of Canada just acknowledged this week that counter tariffs implemented by Ottawa was a main driver when it comes to food inflation in 2025. How many media?
Can you explain that?
Yeah. So there was a report, and I'm not surprised you didn't know because it wasn't covered at all. The Bank of Canada basically released a study on Wednesday, I believe, stating that the biggest driver for food inflation in 2025 was in fact tariffs on imports on food coming from the U.S. And many of these foods were supposed to be CUSMA exempt. And so I was sounding an alarm since April saying, this is just nonsense. What do we do? We're tariffing coffee now?
Okay.
We're tariffing
so
tea?
that's a fascinating story. So that's where for political reasons, there were tariffs that were implemented. I do recall
but here's
that.
the point, David. How many reporters actually reported on the report by the Bank of Canada? One, and that's Bloomberg out of the U.S.
You got to be kidding. So this is absurd. So that was actually self-inflicted pain on consumers that our own government gives to us. Like, talk about shooting ourselves in the foot.
That's why the Elbows Up campaign was incredibly dangerous and reckless, because it led people to believe that we had to hurt Americans. And a lot of Canadians felt, well, we're implementing counter tariffs to hurt Americans, when in actuality, we were hurting Canadians. But I would argue that it wasn't really, the Bank of Canada report was not covered because it actually made the government look bad. It was just the wrong decision to make. Only 2 countries in the world retaliated against America with counter tariffs, and that's China and Canada. And China is very different than Canada. It's in a different place.
So this is quite a revelation, but I think what you're saying then is that sometimes parties that want to create these simplistic black and white narratives, the nuance is totally missed. Namely, surprise, surprise, that Canada and the United States are very integrated economies. Food, as just one example, goes back and forth on the border all the time. So if you impose a tariff for political reasons, because you like the optics of elbows up, that just hurts our own people. So I think that's a very powerful
If
case
you don't
study.
have a public that is well informed, you end up with bad policies, and that's exactly.
Yeah.
So we've been in this funk for quite some time now, and it hasn't stopped. I would say I would go back even before COVID. So it's still going on, and it's hurting. They came public. The GST credit that was announced by Prime Minister Carney in a grocery store in Ottawa, where there were no prices on anything. I don't know if you saw that, David, but
I didn't.
There was a presser with oranges and avocados, and there were no prices. So a stage event,
Isn't that
of course.
ironic?
But how many reporters asked Prime Minister Carney that day, how are we going to pay for the $14 billion? Because it's not in the budget. Zero. It took 3 days for one reporter to ask, how are we going to pay for the $14 billion? We're sleepwalking through fiscal policies. We're sleepwalking through major problems we don't want to face. And that's why we're in trouble.
I was just as shocked as the host when I heard about the counter tariffs that were CUSMA exempt. Unbelievable. Depending on your income and year, the grocery benefit for a single person works out into somewhere in the low teens to the high teens per week. For a family of 4, at the maximum, roughly $35 a week in 2026. People are posting receipts where a box of tampons, some fresh fruit, and a few staples come to around $100. $30-something a week doesn't fix that. It just slows the bleeding a little bit. Sylvain, who tracks this closer than almost anyone in Canada, says it straight. The benefit may offset short-term inflation for lower income households, but the problem is structural. You cannot top up credit your way out of a structural food inflation crisis. He goes into more details in the full interview, again, linked in the description. And remember, this isn't free money. Ottawa is born to do this. In an economy already straining under high prices and high interest rates, pouring billions more into short-term consumption risk adding fuel to a very inflation fire people are trying to escape. It may ease the pain at the checkout this year, but long-term, it could keep prices and debt elevated. And that is the part that should bother everyone regardless of which tribe they are in. So the operating system has not changed. It just got a software update and new branding. Interprovincial trade barriers, still there. Housing starts, nowhere near what was promised. Canada-US relations, strained, with Ottawa quietly slapping counter tariffs on food that was supposed to be CUSMA exempt, and turning the relationship itself into a talking point to score domestic political hits, which we'll also get into. That is the tornado winds card as public perception. A lot of motion, a lot of announcement, a lot of weaponized rhetoric about standing up to America and helping with affordability, while the checkout line does not care about what you call the rebate or which flag you hang on the tariff. Now, layered underneath all that, the structural Senate issue from episode 1 has not fixed itself either. The upper chamber is dominated by Trudeau-era and independent appointees who lean status quo friendly. They are not officially the Liberal caucus, but in practice they form a bloc that can slow or reshape anything too disruptive. That means even if a future Conservative government came in with a full mandate, anything major on energy, carbon, or serious structural reform has to survive the Senate that was intentionally designed to make that very difficult. Before all of Pierre's talking points, we need to instill hope in Canadians. Hope that you will once be able to afford a home. Hope you can buy food. Hope you can feel safe in your neighborhoods. Same mantra as a year ago, just with hope bolted on the front. There's no hope when you don't fix the parliamentary and Senate architecture first, or about planning to break up the monopoly of the 3 grocery chains. Funny how that is absent from the Conservative mantra, and we'll talk about why later in the episode. So that is society collapse in slow motion. The government changes hands, different tie, people feel the strain, the core machinery grinds along regardless. The second layer is the one that most people feel but cannot quite name. Banking and currency, offering donation, corrupt dealings. Those three cards together are basically the oracle way of saying, follow the money and you will understand the full story. Always follow the money. Carney came into politics after years of governor of the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England. Then as a senior executive at the Brookfield Asset Management, one of the largest alternative investment firms in the world. That's not a conspiracy theory, that is his CV. And I still firmly believe he will end up leading the World Economic Forum. Right now, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink is one of the interim co-chairs of the WEF's board, holding space while they work out the post-Schwab era. Given Carney's central bank pedigree and his years at Brookfield, I still think it's more likely than not that he ends up formally leading the forum or something very close to it. That is a theory, not a guarantee, but look at the trajectory. So back to Canada. Symbolically, it was Canada saying, we are comfortable about being managed by someone whose first language is global finance. Since the election, his Brookfield ties have become more than just a talking point. The House Ethics Committee has scrutinized how his assets connected to Brookfield are being handled and what conflicts of interest exist. Opposition MPs have pressed the argument that decisions benefiting Brookfield-connected companies could still enrich the sitting Prime Minister. Now, outside Parliament, there is independent research worth knowing about. There's a guy called David who goes by Moose on the Loose on YouTube. He runs MooseChart.ca. He has been putting in serious documented work for a while now. And I have to be clear of what this actually is. This is not someone drawing conspiracy lines on a whiteboard. He has the receipts, actual articles, actual filings, actually documented sources corresponding to every single connection point on that chart. He's mapped out Carney's Brookfield relationships, the overseas deals, the foreign sovereign investors, the timing between Carney's diplomatic travel as PM and wins for Brookfield-linked entities around the same time. Go look at it yourself, MooseChart.ca. It's a huge mind map of all the connections. I'll put a card up and link it in the description. The dots are there, and the sources are sitting right next to each one of them. When you lay that next to the corrupt dealings and offering donation cards from episode 1, this is not subtle. Now the Davos piece, because I think this one has not gotten nearly enough attention. Carney announced his grocery benefit from an Ottawa grocery store on January 26th. 1 week earlier, he was at the World Economic Forum in Davos, giving speeches about protecting the existing global order, not new order, existing global order. Defending multilateral institutions, keeping the frameworks intact. Here's what I notice about the way that's framed. The message underneath the speech is not about your grocery bill. It's about managing the global system for the people who benefit from the global system. The message is, trust the experts, trust the institutions, trust the frameworks, not each other. And I might add, trust the media, although he didn't say that. But the reality on the ground in Canada and in most Western countries right now is that ordinary people of every background are dealing with the same things. Affordability, safety, cost of living, the sense that the policy is being made by someone else somewhere else. It doesn't matter if you're black, brown, white, indigenous, a recent arrival, or a family that has been here for generations, the concerns are the same. What we have in common now is much bigger than what divides us. But a globalist framing that leads with institutional preservation rather than community does not benefit from us figuring that out. Divisions keep people looking at each other instead of looking at the map. That is the offering donation card operating at a cultural level. Narrative and money flowing from the outside to shape what is politically possible inside Canada. That's layer 2 of the power map, the global money system and the storytelling around it, which quietly overrules what voters thought they decided. Next layer, the provinces that actually keep this country's lights on. In episode 1, I talked about Alberta's resources and how Ottawa's policies have been choking that life force for years. Well, since then, the independence conversation has gotten significantly louder, and Saskatchewan is no longer just watching from the sidelines. The Alberta Prosperity Project has been collecting signatures for a formal independence referendum. Elections Alberta approved their petition process in January. They need just 178,000 verified signatures by May 2nd. I think they've overexceeded them. There was a story that even a huge lineup in Arizona of Canadians down there. If they hit that number, Albertans could be voting on separation as early as October 2026. Maybe. The polling on this is nuanced, and I want to be straight with you. Poilievre surveyed Albertans in December and found about 19% would vote to separate. Research Co. surveyed in early January found 31% support independence. And the number I keep coming back to, 42% of Albertans aged 18 to 34 support it. 42% of young Albertans. That's not fringe, that's basically an entire generation. And here is what also nobody else is covering. The Alberta Prosperity Project met with officials from the U.S. State Department and Treasury on 3 separate occasions between April 2025 and January 2026, according to their statements. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent publicly described Albertans as a very independent people and called Alberta a natural American partner. The official White House line was routine meetings with civil society groups. Okay, sure, we'll go with that line. And the Parti Québécois, Quebec's separatist party, has publicly expressed support for Alberta's movement. Their leader met with the Alberta Prosperity Project leadership in December 2025. Alberta's separation conversation is now intersecting with Quebec's historical grievances, American geopolitical interests, and the structural math of the federal Conservative Party. Here's the math that nobody wants to say out loud. If Alberta and Saskatchewan were to actually walk, the federal Conservative Party, as we know it, is finished. Their core base, their funding, their seat count, overwhelmingly Western. Without that Western spine, the Conservatives become just another centrist party competing for that Laurentian corridor in Ontario and Quebec. So Ottawa has a double incentive. Keep Alberta and Saskatchewan inside the Federation for economic reasons and keep them politically contained so they don't blow up the whole arrangement. At the same time, Quebec has been quietly building its own exits on the legal and monetary side. In October 2025, the government tabled Bill 1, the Quebec Constitution Act 2025. A draft constitution meant to formalize Quebec's constitutional autonomy and define Quebec Constitution as the law of laws in the province. Then on November 15, 2025, Parti Québécois leader Paul St. Pierre Poilievre held a press conference where he laid out step by step how an independent Quebec would roll out its own currency, starting with the Canadian dollar, creating an independent commission, then launching a Quebec currency initially pegged to the US dollar before moving to a full Quebec central bank. All that said out loud on national TV, and it barely registered. Now, I still see Alberta energetically as the liver of Canada. It processes toxins, it generates life force, and it gets lectured by the rest of the body about how dirty it is, while the rest of the body quietly spends the revenue. Even if Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Quebec voted yes on sovereignty, nothing happens automatically. Under Canada's Constitution, the Supreme Court's secession reference, and the Clarity Act, a clear yes would trigger negotiations with Ottawa and the other province over the terms of the breakup. Any actual independence deal would still need to be written into the Constitution, which means federal and provincial sign-off. And once you start looking at these cracks, you find a whole parallel universe of people believing the entire Canadian project is an illusion. In the film Canada the Illusion, the creators walk through a long list of statutes and imperial documents to argue that there is no lawfully established country called Canada at all. Only a corporate structure sitting on top of sovereign provinces. I'll add a card and a link to the video in the description. Whether you agree with that or not, the fact that arguments like this are gaining traction tells you how far trust in federal institutions have fallen. Legally, courts and governments still operate as if Canada was valid. So I'm not telling you to stop paying taxes based on a YouTube video. Just saying. But I'm pointing to the emotional and symbolic reality. More and more people feel like the country they were taught about in school doesn't match the power structure they're actually living under. That is what uprising, rebellion, and social collapse are pointing at. No instant chaos in the streets, but a slow structural fracture, energy, law, money peeling off into competing regional projects. A center that depends on these provinces but refuses to truly share the power with them. And provinces quietly preparing for life after Ottawa. Let's zoom north, because this is what I call the boss level in episode 1, and it has only gotten more relevant. Climate change, whatever you think what the causes are, is thinning Arctic ice and gradually opening summer windows through the Northwest Passage and other northern routes. Shipping experiments out of China are already shaving weeks off Asia-Europe voyages by going through the Arctic instead of the Suez or the Cape. Russia has spent years militarizing its Arctic footprint. Bases, submarines, a large fleet of icebreakers, many of which are nuclear and combat ready. Canada, by contrast, still leans heavily on a small, under-resourced ranger force and a lot of wishful thinking when it comes to actually defending that space.
As the United States continues to threaten the sovereignty of Greenland and Canada, you might be wondering, what does our Arctic security actually look like?
Canada strongly opposes tariffs over Greenland and calls for focused talks to achieve our shared objectives of security and prosperity in the Arctic.
So who for Canada is actually up there, and how does our president stack up against other Arctic powers? Mark Lantain is a political science professor at the Arctic University of Norway, and he is joining us this morning. Welcome to your morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
So Canada controls a large portion of Arctic territory, at least when you look at it on the map. It is massive, but we have only 8 military bases. When you compare that to other countries like Russia, they have between 30 and 40. So how does Canada's Arctic footprint compare to other countries in the region, and why does ours seem to be so much smaller by comparison?
Yes, in terms of overall facilities, Canada has fewer of them than not only Russia, but in some places in the Nordic region. And I think a lot of that for a very long time had to do with basic geography. There was kind of an old saw that if anyone had attempted to attack Canada or invade Canada from the north, they would very likely need rescuing. But times have changed. The nature of Arctic security has changed quite a bit. And it's no longer just a question of hard military issues, but also areas such as hybrid warfare and the fact that the Arctic is becoming much more crowded.
Is there also the idea perhaps that because if you put that map up again, you can see how many bases are in Alaska, for example, that we were reliant on the U.S. to help us protect the North?
Yes, for a long time. Obviously, Canada, with the NORAD agreement and with our geography further away from Russia comparatively than the Nordic region and our proximity to the United States, that also factored into a lot of decisions regarding Canadian Arctic security. Absolutely.
Let's take a closer look at those red dots, which represent Canada's strategic placements. We have, as reported, 100 staffers who are currently posted in the Arctic. But what are their roles? What are their jobs?
They perform a variety of roles, including monitoring, information gathering, in cases search and rescue, and basically what has been referred to as domain awareness, to really understand what kind of potential threats and incursions can happen in the Arctic. And one big difference, of course, between the Canadian Arctic and here in the Nordic region is it's a lot more geography to monitor.
Mm-hmm. So then what are the biggest risks of having this limited physical presence in a region that is becoming increasingly strategic?
Yes, well, first of all, we are seeing obviously a great deal of increased Russian military activity in the Arctic. We're seeing a lot of interest in the Arctic from non-Arctic players such as China. And with the melting of the ice cap, with increasing interest in Arctic resources, we are seeing a lot more potential challenges which could affect Canada's Arctic security and its ability to monitor and ensure the safety of the region.
What kinds of conversations are you having now that you were not having before about Arctic security and what we do with Canada's North?
Well, there's been a lot of discussions. For example, there have been, over the past 2 years, renewed Arctic policy papers and defense papers from the Canadian government, and they really reflect how some of the conversations have changed. Concerns about hybrid warfare, concerns about direct attack on Arctic infrastructure, everything from drones to cable cuts to sabotage. So the whole area of Arctic security has become more complex. And one very positive step in the right direction is we're seeing a lot more dialogue between Canada and the Nordic region, Canada and medium powers, in keeping with Prime Minister Carney's statements yesterday. Yes, exactly. The Nordic Baltic 8 as well.
So then one last question for you. If we are looking to expand and expand quickly into our north, we just did an interview about expanding even at one port in Canada is in the billions of dollars for this project. What could or should expansion look like to secure Canada's north and sovereignty in the north?
Yeah. There's been a lot of discussion. In addition to the possibility of more military and civilian assets in the Arctic, there have also been calls to make greater use, for example, of the Canadian Rangers, as well as to expand Canada's Coast Guard visibility. So there are all kinds of different solutions that not only can come from within Canada, but also in cooperation with other like-minded Arctic states. So a lot of potential there, but there's still a lot of work to do.
And a lot of concern as well. Mark Lantain joining us from Norway this morning. Appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, here's the broader context that rarely gets discussed in mainstream Canadian media. We are in what historians Nigel Howe and the late William Strauss call the fourth turning. The idea is that history moves roughly 80-year cycles, each one ending with a major crisis that reshapes the entire order. The last one was World War II. The current one, by their model, is the unraveling of the post-1945 American-led order and the emergence of a new power contest, primarily between the US-led system and the rising China-Russia axis. Analysts like Ray Diablo have laid out how this plays out geopolitically. Russia and China are not randomly aligned. They are deliberately building an alternative to the dollar-based financial system. Alternative trade routes, alternative alliances, a parallel infrastructure for a world order they intend to shape going forward. In that contrast, the Arctic is not just about shipping, it's about who controls the northern tier of the planet in a world where two competing power blocks are drawing new lines. The west gateway of the Northern Passage is Alaska, already American. East Gateway, Greenland, and the North Atlantic approach. That is why Greenland keeps coming up. That is why Trump's obsession with it. Mid-corridor, Canadian Arctic waters and islands. That is the unsecured piece, and that is us. Fortifying North America in that context is not an irrational idea. If the China-Russia axis is consolidating across Eurasia and the global south, locking the North American perimeter, including the Arctic, has a strategic logic that goes well beyond one person's personality or talking points. So when Carney's government announced the defense industrial strategy and committed to moving towards 2% of GDP on defense, explicitly tied to Arctic security and alliance expectation, that is Canada trying to stay inside a security architecture driven by genuinely real geopolitical shift. This is where the military action card from Carney's spread plugs in. Not Canadian troops invading somewhere, but our defense and industrial policy being pulled into a continental fortification project that is a response to the forces much larger than one election. The question worth sitting with: who benefits from the contracts? Who is writing the industrial strategy? Whose financial networks are being positioned to win the procurement deals? Moose on the loose. Because military action sitting next to corrupt dealings and offering donation in the same reading is definitely not a coincidence. Let's bring Pierre back in for a minute. His card: innocent, truthful, enemy force, explosive situation, planned collapse, and food shortage. A guy who reads more genuine, but walking into a rigged structure, surrounded by hostile forces with real-world scrutiny closing in around him. Here is the Poilievre story that most people missed in the noise. He didn't just lose the election, he lost his own seat in Carleton, Ontario, a riding he had held for 20 years. Lost it on election night to a Liberal named Bruce Fanjoy. He had won that riding 7 straight times. Gone. The longest ballot committee put 91 candidates on the ballot, specifically to split the vote. Federal public servants who Poilievre had pledged to cut turned out in massive numbers. The Liberal campaign drew direct comparisons between Pierre and Trump right up until the wire. That is enemy force operating on his home turf. Then, to get back into the House at all, he had to win a by-election in Battle River, Crowfoot, Alberta, on August 18th, and got 80% of the vote. An Alberta MP named Damian Kruchek stepped aside from his own safe seat so Pierre could run. A Conservative leader, now representing rural Canada, rescued from political irrelevance by the very province that's currently talking about leaving the country. Think about that dynamic for a second. Since then, 3 of his MPs have crossed the floor to the Liberals. Chris Detremont from Nova Scotia in November, Michael Ma from Markham Unionville in December, who ironically attended the Conservative Christmas party and crossed the floor that same night, and Matt Genereux from Edmonton Riverbend this month, an Alberta MP who cited Carney's Davos speech as his inspiration. The Liberal House leader has publicly said there are more. His words: he has spoken to other Conservative MPs who are unhappy and that they exist. Now, if you listen to the Conservatives not plugged into the influencer echo chamber, you'll hear a different story. They'll tell you this isn't just about Pierre's leadership at the top. It's about who the party is actually nominating. Center-left blue Liberal candidates picked to chase the middle, while stronger small C Conservatives are being pushed aside. In that reading, the floor crossers are a symptom of a deeper identity crisis inside the party, not just one bad day in the House. That is the enemy force inside your own house. That is explosive situation in real time. Now, strategically, what is the Conservative Party doing in response? Still chasing the center, softening the edges, turning the plain, talking, apple-eating guy people actually connected with online.
On the topic, I mean, in terms of your sort of strategy currently, you're obviously taking the populist pathway.
What does that mean?
Well, appealing to people's more emotional levels, I would guess. I mean, certainly you tap very strong ideological language quite frequently.
Like what?
Left wing, this and that, right wing, I mean, it's that type of ideological thing.
I never really talk about left or right.
But anyways, a lot of people
don't really believe in that.
Okay. A lot of people would say that you're simply taking a page out of the Donald Trump book.
Like which people would say that?
Well, I'm sure a great many Canadians, but...
Like who?
I don't know who, but...
Well, you're the one who asked the question, so
yeah.
You must know somebody.
Okay, I'm sure there's some out there, but anyways, the point of this question is, I mean, why should Canadians trust you with their vote, given not just the sort of ideological inclination in terms of taking the page out of Donald Trump's book, but
what are you
also,
talking about? What page? What page? Can you give me a page? Give me the page. You keep saying
in terms of turning things quite dramatically in terms of Trudeau and the left wing and all of this. I mean, you make quite a, it's quite a play that you make on it. So I'm
not
just
sure.
Wondering.
I don't know what your question is.
Then forget that. Why should Canadians trust you with their vote?
Common sense. Okay. Common sense for a change.
Into someone who delivers poll-tested talking points in a Navy suit. Some people have started calling him Pierre O'Toole, a reference to Aaron O'Toole, who led the Conservatives before Pierre. O'Toole's strategy was sanding down the rough edges, chase the Laurentian vote, trying to be things to all people. He lost both his base and the political center. That is exactly what the muted rebel archetype looks like when the party machine gets a hold of it. In episode 1, I said directly, if Pierre does not speak his truth more fully, the field will eat him. The planned collapse card is still sitting there. Not necessarily his personal collapse, the collapse of people's hope that one election, one guy, one party can fix a structure that has been rotting away for decades. Also wanted to note in episode 1 when we looked at Pierre's spread, one of the strangest cards that came up was food shortage. At the time, I felt it out of place. I read it more as pressure around food than literally empty shelves. 10 months later, with Pierre hammering grocery affordability in every speech, because that is where people feel the pain the most, that card suddenly makes a lot more sense. It was pointing to the political center of gravity shifting to the dinner table. Let me step back from the analysis for a second. Living in this power map feels like this. You vote, the government changes. Your grocery bill is still the worst in the G7. You watch Western provinces seriously discussing leaving and Ottawa dismissing them in public while quietly panicking about what happens if they actually walk. You watch your Prime Minister fly to Davos to give speeches about protecting the global order, then come home and announce a rebate that is essentially the same rebate as the last guy, but with a different name. You hear about Carney's ethics screen on Brookfield, while independent researchers like Moose on the Loose at MooseChart.ca, who has documented sources for every single connection point, and parliamentary committees who are showing how entangled his financial interests remain with global corporate decisions. That is pandemic health crisis and society collapse as a psychological state. Burnout, cynicism, that low-grade sense that the game is rigged and nobody is actually steering towards your own interests. And here's what I want to say clearly, because I think it matters. This is not a right-wing feeling or a left-wing feeling. It's a human feeling. Whether you're in Fort McMurray or in Brampton or Montreal, whether your family has been here for generations or arrived 5 years ago, the concerns are the same. Affordability, safety, the sense that people making decisions are not accountable to you. What we have in common right now is much bigger than what divides us. But a political and media system that depends on managing those divisions does not benefit from us figuring that out. Seeing the power map clearly is not doom. It's a beginning of getting your energy back. So where does that leave us after the cards? The spread from episode 1 told us the energetic themes: money stress, foreign interference, rising tension, and possible collapse. 10 months later, the real world is matching them. Food inflation leading the G7. Brookfield conflicts being examined in committee. Alberta, Saskatchewan, Quebec seriously considering their exits. Trump and the China-Russia dynamic reshaping the Arctic and North American defense. A Senate that quietly keeps everything within certain guide rails, regardless of who wins elections. We didn't even get into China's role in this episode, about their political influence and other operations. That is a whole other layer of the map, and we will get back to it in a future episode. You and I cannot redraw that map overnight, but we can become literate in it. So I will leave you with 3 questions to sit with this week. 1. At my local level, my city, my province. Who actually makes the decisions that affect my daily life? Do I even know their names? 2. Where does my money and attention currently flow? Into Ottawa or global brands, or into my local economy, my own skills, my own community? That question hits differently when you live in a country where people are cutting back on food, rent, and basics just to get through the month, while billions are being committed to military and foreign aid packages overseas, including to Ukraine. Back when Canada first started sending money to Ukraine over 10 years ago, I asked my late mother what she thought about it. I'm paraphrasing here, but she said something like, "Why are we sending money there when it's needed here?" I remember staring at her, completely confused. I said, "How can you say that? It's our country." I'm Ukrainian, by the way. She looked at me and replied, "Because I'm Canadian." And coming from someone who was Ukrainian through and through, that exchange shocked me, and it has stayed with me ever since. That represents many Canadians who don't follow the mainstream media or government narrative. 3. What is the one small lever I can realistically move this year, instead of screaming at the levers I will never touch? Maybe it's how you're changing your spending, where you bank, what media you let into your life. Maybe it's just staying aware, not letting the system gaslight you into confusion or vital fear. Maybe read past the headlines to the real story behind the headline in the last 2 paragraphs, or buried in the story. None of these are dramatic. They do not make for good headlines, but this is where your real agency lives. Because the truth is not always trending. But if you can see the power map, you are no longer just a piece on someone else's board. You are at least playing your own game. And if this episode helped you connect some dots, share it with someone who is feeling politically fried but spiritually awake. And please don't forget to like and subscribe. And next time on Dusrupted, we are going to take this one level further. 3 timelines for Canada: outright collapse, grinding stalemate, or a quiet bottom-up revolution. Which one are we actually heading towards? Until then, stay grounded, stay curious, stay disrupted.